The ocean was never silent during the Second World War. Beneath the gray swells of the Atlantic, steel shapes moved unseen, predatory and relentless. They were German U-boats, slender, cramped, diesel-stinking machines crewed by young men who lived for weeks without sunlight. To Allied sailors, their presence meant dread. A freighter's hum could be cut short in seconds by a torpedo's violent bloom. Between September 1939 and the end of 1945, the numbers became staggering. More than 3,000 documented attacks tore through Allied and neutral shipping. Over 14 million tons of cargo disappeared beneath the waves. Coal, grain, oil, everything a modern war machine needed to survive. 72,000 merchant seamen, most of them civilians, lost their lives in that hidden war. For them, the sea was both workplace and grave. But behind those numbers lay darker choices. U-boats did not only strike convoys. 47 times they attacked vessels clearly marked as hospital ships. 68 times survivors in lifeboats, adrift and helpless, found themselves under fire. Salt water splashed red around wreckage. The same ocean that had carried them to safety became the stage of their execution. Inside a submarine, the reality was claustrophobic. The air grew foul after days at sea, laced with diesel fumes, sweat, and oil. Crewmen slept in shifts, bunks shared like borrowed clothes. Every valve hiss, every creak of the pressure hull reminded them how thin the line was between life and a steel tomb. Orders were followed with precision, because hesitation could mean being crushed by the ocean itself. To the men who lived it, survival justified anything. To those who witnessed their attacks, it felt like cruelty stripped bare. Imagine the contrast. On the surface, a convoy sailor gripping the rail of a burning ship, smoke clawing at his lungs. Below, in the red-lit control room of a U-boat, sailors pressed ears to hydrophones, listening for the crackle of sinking steel. Two worlds separated by only meters of water, yet locked in a struggle without mercy. The commanders spoke of strategy, of starving Britain to surrender by cutting its lifeline of supplies, but strategy blurred into crime when the rules of war dissolved. The Geneva Convention promised protection for the wounded and shipwrecked. In practice, the Atlantic was too vast, the pressure too intense, and the orders too uncompromising. Survivors often became targets. Every logbook entry, every position marked on a naval chart told part of that story. Coordinates like 36 degrees 58 minutes north, 17 degrees 15 minutes west. The final resting place of U-124, where 49 men were lost with no survivors. Each number was a point on the map where lives ended. Families received letters that never explained enough, and grief stretched across oceans. And yet, inside Germany, these same submariners were celebrated as heroes. Posters showed proud young officers in peaked caps, the wolves of the Atlantic. The reality was far more fragile. Most U-boat crews never saw the war's end. Of nearly 40,000 men who served beneath the waves, more than 28,000 never returned. To climb down that narrow hatch was to accept the odds were against you. The ocean carried no ideology. It swallowed steel and flesh alike. What remained was silence, broken only by the occasional lifeboat drifting among debris. For sailors, the choice was simple: hunt or be hunted. But in that choice lay the seeds of the reckoning to come. Because the war beneath the waves did not end with the surrender of Germany. The ocean's victims were counted, but the men responsible were still alive, captured, and waiting in prison camps. Their fates would no longer be written by torpedoes, but by judges, guards, and governments deciding what justice meant after so much blood. And so from the roar of explosions and the cold grip of the sea, the story now moves inland, into courtrooms, wire-ringed prisons, and the long shadow of responsibility.
The war silence was broken not by gunfire, but by the scrape of boots on concrete floors, the clang of iron gates, and a hum of life behind barbed wire. For thousands of captured U-boat men, the end of fighting did not bring freedom. It brought captivity, years measured not by patrols across the Atlantic, but by prison routines and the slow tick of unanswered questions. At Featherstone Park, November 7th, 1947, Karl-Heinz Mola received a letter with a Red Cross seal. The paper was thin, the ink official. Inside, the words were final. His younger brother, who had served aboard U-124, had gone down with the boat when HMS Stewart destroyed it 4 years earlier, on April 2nd, 1943. No survivors, no body recovered, just coordinates in the Atlantic and a list of 49 men lost. For Karl, the news arrived not as a shock of battle, but as an echo carried years too late. The war had ended, yet still reached into his cell with cold hands. Others lived the consequences in harsher ways. Obersbootsman Hans Kesler, who had served aboard U-181, was sentenced in January 1948 to 20 years in a converted Wehrmacht barracks. His new world was 8 feet by 10, shared with 2 other men. One a deserter, the other an SS officer condemned for reprisals in Yugoslavia. Days began at 5:30, meals at fixed hours, and lights out by 21:30. Between those markers came endless hours assembling wire radios for the British military. Pay: 15 pfennigs a day, credited to an account he could not touch. Freedom reduced to numbers on a ledger. Daily life was stripped of dignity. Kesler's cell smelled of damp uniforms and fatigue. The wire fences outside were layered, 3 deep, impossible to mistake for anything but confinement. And yet even here, moments of strange humanity appeared. Cigarette papers became calendars. Scraps of soap carved into chess pieces passed the hours. Men measured survival not in years, but in days crossed off with pencil stubs. Far above these cells, in Nuremberg, the machinery of judgment ground on. On April 28, 1948, Admiral Erich Raeder, once Germany's highest-ranking naval officer, was sentenced to life imprisonment. The tribunal judged him guilty of planning aggressive war and unleashing unrestricted submarine operations that defied international law. His legacy was not strategy, but responsibility for a campaign that blurred military necessity into deliberate crime. The court's words carried weight, yet even they could not balance the scale of destruction that had already been written into the ocean floor. The irony was sharp. Ordinary sailors counted each ration of bread and each night on a thin cot. Admirals stood trial beneath the eyes of history, their fates debated in grand halls. But whether behind a courtroom bench or in a prison barrack, the men of the U-boats shared one truth. The war had followed them home, and it would not let go. Some prisoners clung to bitterness, insisting they were soldiers caught in politics. Others bent quietly to the routines, hoping cooperation might shorten their time. For Karl-Heinz Mola, it was the memory of a brother's absence that haunted the long nights. For Hans Kesler, it was the calendar on cigarette paper, counting years that felt endless. For Admiral Raeder, it was the realization that his decisions. The iron gates of Featherstone Park creaked open not with the promise of release, but with a bargain. In March 1948, the British government announced that captured U-boat crewmen could walk free on one condition. They had to sign 2-year contracts in the British merchant fleet. For diesel engineers, radio operators, and navigators, the choice was stark: indefinite detention or a return to the sea under a flag they once hunted. The offer was pragmatic. Britain's shipping lanes lay in ruins, and her post-war economy depended on rebuilding a fleet capable of carrying coal, grain, and goods across the Atlantic. Skilled hands were scarce. Men who once stalked convoys were now asked to keep them afloat. Survival demanded irony. One of the first to volunteer was Maskenenrainer Renner Liebig of U-96. With 17 Atlantic patrols behind him, Liebig carried the kind of experience Britain needed most. The war had forced him into the shadows of submarine engine rooms, where pistons pounded and sweat mixed with diesel fumes. Now, that same knowledge made him invaluable as a chief engineer aboard cargo vessels. For Liebig, the decision was less about loyalty than necessity. The alternative was endless confinement, a life spent waiting for freedom that might never come. By July 1948, the SS Manchester Commerce steamed out of Liverpool, bound for Montreal. In her crew were 5 former U-boat men. Liebig tended the engines. Peter Kellner worked the radios. Heinrich Brunn hauled lines as an able seaman. Each man wore the crisp blue uniform of the British Merchant Marine. Their papers listed them as veterans of Atlantic convoys from 1947 to 1948. Nowhere did it say that only a few years earlier they had hunted those same routes with torpedoes primed. The contrast was almost unbearable. On deck, they traced the same North Atlantic swells they once prowled from below. The same icy spray lashed their faces. The same storms beat against steel hulls. But the silence of a submarine's control room had been replaced with the roar of open engines, the shouts of deckhands, and the clang of cargo chains. For some, the rhythm of honest labor dulled the sting of memory. For others, every wave carried echoes of the past. Pay was steady, £4 and 10 shillings a month, plus room and board. Contracts guaranteed repatriation to Germany when service ended. To their British shipmates, these men were simply workers, useful, quiet, perhaps a little strange. Few asked questions. Fewer still wanted answers. On the open sea, survival depended on cooperation, not history. Yet the tension never disappeared entirely. To stand watch on the same waters where comrades had been lost, to serve under a flag once seen as the enemy. This demanded a silence thicker than any official order. The men rarely spoke of their wartime pasts. Instead, they focused on navigation charts, engine pressure gauges, or the static crackle of the radio. Duty gave them a new identity, one that erased questions better left unspoken. For some, the contracts became stepping stones. Liebig would complete his service, log thousands of miles, and carry a British certificate qualifying him to work as an engineer anywhere in the world. Kellner, too, gained the experience that secured civilian employment beyond the sea. What began as a condition for release slowly became a path to survival in a country desperate to rebuild. Still, not all found release through work. Behind the fences of other camps, men like Hans Kesler counted down years in prison. Sentences were reduced, early releases negotiated, but freedom came with conditions: lifetime bans on naval service, constant oversight, and the weight of stigma. While some sailed into new lives, others endured the slow grind of punishment. The war had divided them once into hunters and hunted. Now it divided them again. Those who built futures in silence, and those who remained tethered to the past. And as Germany itself began the slow process of reconstruction, these former submariners faced another challenge: how to return home and live among civilians who wanted to forget the war entirely. Some blended into factories and workshops. Others carried scars too deep to hide. The next chapter of their lives would not be written at sea, but in steelworks, offices, and homes where military service became a secret, never spoken aloud. In the rubble of post-war Germany, survival was measured not in victories, but in quiet routines. Essen steelworks belched smoke into a sky still scarred by bombing raids. On the factory floor, sparks from welding torches lit the faces of men rebuilding their country one beam at a time. Among them stood Friedrich Steinhoff, once a submariner on U-177. His discharge papers mentioned nothing of the 8 ships his boat had sunk, only honorable release No further action required. Now, he was a machine operator